Hi everyone, welcome to the session. My name's Henry Murison. It's great that you can join us here today, virtually here in the Northwest. And I think it's really great. We've got such a great panel of speakers to talk about the challenge of accelerating change across our transport network. And that's very much about getting to net zero and what that means in terms of the journeys people make every day and how that enables change in our economy as well. So our speakers today include Peter Cole, who's the Principal Environmental and Sustainability Officer at Transport for North, Tricia Williams, the Chief Operating Officer at Northern Rail, Sam Pook, Senior Public Policy Manager at VOI Technology, Nicola Kane, Head of Strategic Planning and Research from TFGM, and we've also got Marsden, Research Director at Miralis. So it really only falls to me to encourage you to ask questions during the session. The panelists can see the questions you're asking, so we hopefully see we'll get to those through the discussion. And I'm also really keen to make sure that we hear as much in that kind of general discussion and debate as we can about the themes that we're trying to cover today. So I'm first going to ask Peter to give us his first kind of few kind of provocations and thoughts in this space, sort of thinking about what are the exciting developments and what does sustainability mean in the context of TfN's work on a strategic transport plan for the North and how we can unlock connectivity but also decarbonise our economy and our society at the same time. So Peter, really keen to hear your thoughts.
Hi, it's Jack Snape here standing in for Peter Cole. So I'm,
sorry, apologies, Jack.
No problem. I'm analysis manager at Transport for the North, so I work closely with Peter on the evidence base for our decarbonisation strategy. I think it's a critical time for decarbonising transport. There's been a huge amount of movement and development in the past 12 months. Obviously, the changing travel patterns post-COVID, post-pandemic, present a huge opportunity to shift behaviours into more sustainable choices, and that's coupled with political mood around investment in infrastructure and building back better, which I think means that there's a real opportunity in the year ahead. Also, at a global scale, there are big movements around setting targets across the developed and the developing world, and that's leading to big technological changes like rapidly falling costs of batteries, which are really important not only for electric cars, but also for new types of mobility, such as e-bikes and e-scooters, and very importantly, freight vehicles, where we're starting to see electric technology come in. At Transport for the North, we're looking across the whole transport system, and we've developed a decarbonisation strategy that's just been published and is out for consultation at the moment. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And in terms of how we look at investment in infrastructure now, we're moving beyond just looking at time savings and productivity and developing a new appraisal framework that looks at a triple bottom line for the economy, for social value, and also the environment. So that we think sustainable infrastructure will be more prioritised through this new appraisal system that we're rolling out. So yeah, a lot happening this year. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jack. And I was now going to turn to Tricia Williams, Chief Operating Officer at Northern Rail. Some fantastic projects in the offing to make real difference across the network, particularly as we deal with the fact that clearly electrification across the North and the Northwest has been a great success, but there are some parts of the network we've not been able to reach yet through some of those conventional solutions to decarbonising the railway. So Tricia, really excited you can be with us today, and lovely to see you again in your not quite new role, having entered the rail industry from your long history in infrastructure and wider transport. So great you can be with us here today, and be really excited to hear your thoughts. And I know this isn't just your area, it's a lot of people around the business, so thanks for bringing their insights as well from across the business to this discussion.
No, delighted to be here, Henry. Thank you for having me. And it's probably worth setting some context really. For rail, it's all about moving from our diesel fleet to an electric fleet. At the moment, about a third of our fleet is electric, but only about a quarter of the track we use is electrified. So there's clearly a significant investment needed still in track and train. But in the interim, we are doing some exciting things. And just last month, we introduced trains that can run at both electric mode and in diesel mode. So for example, you can get on at Southport as a diesel train, and then the train will stop at various stops, and at Bolton the pantograph will go up and it'll pick up the electrified part of the network there. So what we need to be doing whilst our modernisation strategy takes place is looking at innovative ways of actually making the most of the electrification that does exist and making the most of our diesel engines, and whether that's bi-mode diesel and electric, or even tri-mode where you've got the mix of battery in there. They're all options we are considering.
Thank you so much, Tricia. That's really helpful. And I think in the discussion, I know we'll maybe hear about some of those exciting projects like up in the Lake District, which I'm particularly keen to get into. So we'll bring in some of the rest of our panelists and then maybe come back to that particular one. And next, we're going to ask Sam Poole from VOI Technology to make their contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Morning, everyone. So I'm from VOI Technology, and we are the UK's largest e-scooter operator. For those of you that don't know, electric scooters were introduced to the UK last year by the DFT. They permitted local authorities to run trials. The main reason for e-scooters being introduced was to help provide a sustainable, socially distant mode of travel to help ease pressure on public transport during a pandemic. And when it comes to the Northwest in particular, our presence is focused in Liverpool currently. So we are the exclusive operator of e-scooters in Liverpool and have been since October last year. And I think it's no stretch to say that Liverpool has quite quickly staked its flag in the ground and is very near to becoming the e-scooter capital of Europe, at least where VOI is concerned. The numbers that we've seen is fantastic. And for a mode of transport that a lot of people might have been a bit conservative about, given it's, the first new mode of transport allowed on roads for a long time, they really have taken off. And we just hit our 1 million rides in Liverpool, which for 9 months is fantastic. We've got cities in Europe which have had e-scooters legalized for a long time, and it takes a lot longer in those cities which might traditionally lend themselves a bit more well to e-scooters, but they've taken a lot longer, and the take up in Liverpool has been fantastic. And to say that we've hit 1 million rides and over 12% of those have been free or discounted for NHS, so we've been able to provide electric modes of transport to key workers during the pandemic. And one of the key things that we're seeing is, and what we're trying to push, is this sort of modal shift. So our surveys and our in-app messages are telling us that around 31% of our users in Liverpool are telling us that they would have used a car for their journey instead of a scooter if that scooter wasn't available. So that's equating to over 300,000 fewer car journeys have been taken in the 9 months that we've been in Liverpool. That totals up to some really fantastic numbers. So over 150 tons of CO2 has been saved, 66,000 litres of gasoline has not been burnt. So even though e-scooters are very new to the market, we're starting to see some real benefits from them in the short time we've been live already.
Thanks so much. And I was actually going to turn to Andy Brown, who was a last minute addition, which is why I hadn't introduced you before, Andy. So sorry for that, as I can't quite in this light outside see all the names under people's faces, so makes it slightly harder. In fact, I can't necessarily see all of you. I hope some of you can see me. Andy, obviously Manchester Airport plays a huge part in the connectivity of the wider north of England and of the nation, one of the UK's 2 nationally designated airports, as well as being a key facility for the Northwest. Obviously, we've seen perhaps a real from government for the aviation sector. And my kind of challenge was really, to what extent is that going to hold back the transition to sustainability? Because obviously this imposed crisis from COVID, made worse by lack of support by government for aviation, is that setting back the aviation agenda? And what can we do to give businesses in this space the confidence and the certainty in their own future to be able to also invest in that net zero transition?
Well, tough first question. Thanks, Henry. But yeah, it's been a very difficult time for the aviation sector over the last year. But I think while we've had a lot of struggles with government on arguing for the support that we think the sector needs, and frankly still needs, although this session isn't about COVID support, the one thing that they've been loud and clear on throughout and working really closely with us throughout is the need to keep making progress on sustainability. Today, by pure coincidence, is the latest meeting of the government's Jet Zero Council that was set up last year. And there is still a lot of momentum, I think, on industry and government co-working on sustainability, and some really important announcements that have been made over the last 6 or so months, including continuing to make progress with sort of not very sexy but really important initiatives like modernising airspace that will make air travel a lot more efficient. So I'm quietly confident that I think that COVID won't have that much of an impact on the real progress that we are starting to make towards aviation sustainability. Lots of big other impacts that we need to manage as a sector, but sustainability is something we're all still really committed to.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And I'm sure we can come back a bit specific opportunities in the Northwest in terms of leading on this agenda in the discussion. I was next going to turn to Nicola, our colleague, one of our colleagues from the public sector. Obviously, TfGM, through the development of the tram network, have made huge contributions to enabling more sustainable travel choices. And obviously, the B network and the wider historical work that's been done by the Metro Mayor and by previous iterations of the political leadership around walking and cycling have been really impressive. To what extent, Nicola, do you find that kind of bus regulation and franchising will allow you to drive new technology choices? Clearly, at the moment, it's a bit of a free-for-all in the bus industry, what happens, and to what extent around the transition to whether it be hydrogen or electricity, does building your own bus depots, having all that infrastructure potentially bespoke, really enable that transition to happen? We've heard a lot about the benefits to passengers from a move towards greater control over buses and public direction of services. To what extent will the net zero transition for public transport in Greater Manchester be easier with those levers at your disposal, do you think?
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, buses are clearly very high on our list of priorities at the moment. We see huge potential for sort of increasing the bus market in Greater Manchester, making it a mode that's really attractive to a whole range of passengers, people from all walks of life, as it is in other great cities around the world. And I think part of that is making sure that the fleet of vehicles not only is sort of comfortable from a passenger perspective, but is clean and non-polluting. So I think being able to manage that through a franchise system will have its challenges, no doubt. We've got a huge amount of work to do ahead of us in terms of setting out those franchising and making sure we've got the right fleet on the road over the next few years. But I think, as you say, there's no doubt that being able to coordinate that across the whole conurbation and to look at how we bring through that fleet will, I think, make it easier for us to achieve the kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And we've just very recently announced our proposals, still to sort of go through the final approval route, but to launch a clean air zone from next May in Greater Manchester, which will focus on commercial vehicles. So it will focus on HGVs and buses in the first instance from next May, and then from the following May looking at other commercial vehicles. And I think that will help to drive that transition to much cleaner, greener vehicles, and to give businesses the support they need to help make that transition. So I think there's a huge amount going on right across the whole transport space in Greater Manchester, and it's a really exciting place to be involved in transport at the moment.
No, I couldn't agree more. And last but not least, Will from Mirage, with your insights, and then we'll get into a bit of a more of a to and fro. And I have to explain, I am on a site of significance to the northwest. I'm one of the locations for proposed NPR stations here in Bradford, obviously. And at the moment, there isn't a single electrified line across the Pennines. None of the routes currently are electrified. So I'll come back to that with you, Tricia, a little bit about perhaps the benefits of electrification in terms of frequency and reliability of services, not just in terms of its environmental benefits, and some of those alternative solutions, just to give you a bit of advance notice of who I'll be coming to after Will.
Just probably I should give a brief introduction to what Moralis and who Moralis are. We are not one of these up and front companies working that everyone knows who we are. We actually do a lot on electric vehicle transition in the background, and we have systems that support this and actually facilitate the use of electric vehicles. We also work heavily with the logistics industry, trying to decarbonize the logistics industry moving forward, both in terms of electrification and other technologies as well. So that's our basic background, and at the moment we're working very hard with also non-for-profit companies in the northwest to try and push out electric vehicle charging infrastructure, as well as local authorities across the north of England and indeed Scotland. So I think that's probably a good introduction to us at the moment. So thanks, Henry.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to you, Will, a bit during the discussion, I hope, on some of the themes that you'll be able to contribute on. So Tricia, obviously, we love electrification. There's some great new improvements thanks to the electrification, the long-awaited electrification of services to places like Bolton. Obviously, we lived through the joy of electrifying some of those tunnels, which I don't think anyone had touched since the Victorians had built them. And I suppose they did work, so I understand why we hadn't poked around too much. But then I think we realised they weren't held up by very much in the first place. In terms of those benefits of electrification, but also some of those benefits of some of the schemes we were talking about. I know I alluded earlier in the conversation to what might be possible up in the lake. Should we maybe talk a bit about one of those alternative solutions, but also maybe reflect on the benefits to passengers from electrification, where it's commercial and practical for Network Rail to deliver that as part of their wider investment programme?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely benefit in electrification. I was struck when I joined Rail about the complexity in the fleet types, and that obviously leads to some complexity in things like maintenance and actually driving the different types of fleet. So having a simplified network would allow us to simplify the fleet. So that's certainly something. And the other advantage, they are faster. So electric fleet can accelerate quicker. But also in a post-COVID world, and I think somebody mentioned that before, I think it was Jack, we need to understand how demand is going to change. And at the moment, we're seeing some really fantastic demand coming back to places like Blackpool, Liverpool was mentioned before. And it's a struggle to try and manage that with different types of fleets. So obviously, if we had full electrification and a full electric fleet, we would be able to manage that a lot better. That's not going to happen overnight. So in the meantime, we are looking at these different types of modes of fleet. So we can have battery with diesel, for example, and that's certainly something we are looking at in different parts of the Northwest. And as I mentioned before, we've got the flex units on the Southport to Manchester line, where we've got that ability to flex between diesel and electric. So you can understand then when we start talking about different interim solutions before we get full electrification, it adds complexity. And whilst we're up for managing that and being able to look at these different alternative ways of decarbonising, the future has to be full electrification and a full electric fleet.
Thanks, Tricia. I think that's really exciting. And I mean, I'm particularly excited to see some of the projects you're at the stage of being able to deploy, which is why we're such big supporters at MPP of what you've got proposed up on the line towards Windermere, because I think we can see the benefits in terms of leading the way on some of this technology as well, which is that clearly we're not the only place in the world that has perhaps this challenge of not necessarily having all the pantographs it would want when it wants it. And so being able to deploy this technology and also bring benefits to communities around the wider net zero transition. Clearly, transport is just one of the things we need to change the way we approach in our society. And I think the rail network is certainly playing a great role in helping to kind of catalyse the wider debate about what decarbonisation will look like. And clearly, as a wider network around the transition of freight, for instance, has a huge role in reducing demand on other areas. So it's very hard to decarbonise heavy freight. Clearly, the rail network's going to play a great role in that. I was now going to sort of maybe take a bit of an aviation lens and hand back to Manchester Airport to what might be achievable and what some of the projects are that you think your airlines in particular might want to bring to the Northwest. And I'm particularly interested to talk maybe a bit about regional connectivity. Clearly, connectivity to London will be enabled much more easily for the Northwest from HS2, but there are some parts of the country, as we've sort of observed through Peter Hendy's review into connectivity across the nations, where there is still an important role for domestic aviation. To what extent do you think electrification of shorter flights might help to reduce the carbon intensity of that part of the sector? Because to us, certainly at MPP, that seems like a great opportunity to not have to make a false choice between connectivity and environmental sustainability, Andy.
Yeah, I think the way I look at it, aviation has a huge challenge of sustainability, right? It's one of the hardest sectors of the whole economy, not just of transport, to decarbonise. And I think the challenge comes under three broad headings. The first is how you get people, whether that's staff or customers, to and from your airport. And that's where projects like HS2 and NPR are going to be critical. And actually MPR, we're massive supporters of both schemes, not least because they will come together at a new station at Manchester Airport, but they're also just fundamentally critical to levelling up the north. But probably MPR has a bit of an edge on HS2. We need both, but MPR will give Manchester Airport that much more connectivity as the gateway internationally for the north. Yeah, connectivity to London is really important, but Manchester is first and foremost the international gateway for the north. So we need to make sure that as many people can get there as sustainably as possible. And MPR will make a massive difference to that. It will mean that half of the people living across the north can get to the airport in under an hour and a half. That's a game changer in terms of sustainability to get to the airport. Second thing is how we as an airport operator deal with our operations on the ground. Boring stuff behind the scenes, like the sustainability of our fleet of ground vehicles. And we're making pretty good progress on that. And actually, MAG was the first airport operator in the UK to get carbon neutral at our airport. So we're already well on the way towards net zero. And we have a target that we have a credible plan to get to by net zero by 2038. So in line with the wider Manchester target for that. But yes, as you point out, Henry, the biggest challenge, the third one, is how you get people up in the air, right? That's the carbon intensive bit of aviation. And we're relatively limited in what we can do directly, but we have a lot of influence that we can exert over our airline partners. So yes, I think electric vehicles, electric planes will be an important part of that, but I don't want to kid anyone to think that they're going to come along tomorrow. They're sort of at the back end of the plan that UK aviation has signed up to as a sector as a whole, actually, and the first aviation sector in the world to sign up to getting to net zero by 2050. So that's a really ambitious but credible target, and it will mean electric vehicles for the shorter haul journeys towards the back end of that time frame. But what I'm really keen that we don't lose sight of is the targets, the real activities we can do in the shorter term to get the rest of the plan in place. And that's things like sustainable fuels. And the North is going to be home to the first sustainable aviation fuel plant in the next 5 years that's directly connected to an airport at Manchester. So that's really, really great for the Northwest. And boring but important things like sorting out our airspace so that people don't fly around in circles in the air burning fuel that they don't need to. So there's a lot of challenges, but we have a credible plan to get there.
I mean, I was going to come back really to get a perspective from Transport for the North. Obviously, we talked a bit about MPR, a key project that TfN colleagues I know are helping to lead, and obviously Tim and his team at the MPR team have been working so hard on for the last few years. As we approach the IRP, clearly the sustainability of these projects is really important. So I suppose I was keen to understand to what extent MPR is in part about reducing the need for more carbon intensive modes of travel. Obviously it unlocks freight capacity that we've alluded to before, but a lot of people, obviously environmental movements, have chosen to attack projects like HS2 as an environmental negative. To what extent do we need to recast the debate to think about the ongoing sustainability of journeys and modes and the role that rail capacity has to play in avoiding the need, for instance, to build a lot more roads, or people still needing to drive lorries that are very hard to decarbonise the network in terms of the strategic road network? Is that something from a TfN perspective you could give a view on, Jack?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a number of ways in which MPR is really key for decarbonisation. Obviously, rail is one of the best ways to get people into urban centres, and it's going to be much more attractive than road transport. Now, with MPRs built in the kind of 2030s to 2040s, we do expect there to be more electric vehicles on the road, so that will kind of start to minimise the direct decarbonisation impact. But it's still going to be very important from a number of other sustainability perspectives, in terms of, cars have their own embodied emissions, they take up space, they cause a lot of kind of problems in urban areas that rail helps to mitigate. A really important one that's perhaps kind of underexplored is the role rail can play in supporting sustainable urban development. So particularly where we've got new rail stations, like where you stood there, Henry, if areas that are very well connected by rail are developed, you have more people kind of living closer to where they work. That's going to support sustainable transport more generally, even for people that aren't directly using the rail network. So rail has a real role to play in unlocking land and supporting development in these really well connected places. I think MPR is going to be key to that in a number of locations. I think Warrington is a good example, and places around South Yorkshire as well. Finally, we need to look at the embodied emissions from the infrastructure. So obviously building bridges and tunnels is carbon intensive. and that there's you know, that if we want to build new infrastructure, there is going to be a certain amount of embodied emissions, but we're really committed at TFN to looking at how we can mitigate that and use new technology, use kind of modern methods of construction to try and ensure that happens as little as possible, and that there's enough kind of tree planting and other things to offset as much of that as possible. So yeah, a number of angles that we're looking at sustainability in with an NPR hat on.
I was going to say, Sam, you may have seen in the chat, I don't know if you've seen it in the Blue Stage chat, a question for you. So I'm conscious I've dominated the conversation, that we've got some great questions coming in from our attendees. So do you want to maybe answer that question that's been directed to you, and then I'll come round and maybe come to some of the wider questions that we were getting from others about a number of different modes of travel and their sustainability credentials.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question in the chat was which is more sustainable, e-bikes or e-scooters? We operate both, so it's largely the same for us. But I think the main thing that you need to think about is it's the same two questions really that you need to think about when you're approaching scooters or bikes. And the first is, are you using green energy? And then the second is, what are your supply chains like? Because I think a lot of businesses, if their product or vehicle has the letter E in front of it, automatically think, therefore, we're sustainable. But, a business and an operator has a responsibility to make sure that, your whole of your supply chains are sustainable and green. You can't just get away with, having a product with the letter E in front of it. So at Void, for example, we directed EY a few years ago to complete a life cycle analysis looking at the whole of our operation. So it started with, what are the materials that we're using, what is the manufacturing process like for our scooters, what vehicles are we using for the logistics, so when we actually take the scooters and the bikes out on the streets and we're putting them out, make sure that we're using electric vehicles for those. So for example, we have cargo bikes in Liverpool where local staff ride around the city and they replace the batteries, for example, and we have electric vans to carry out a lot of our logistics works. But then also looking at, what do we do with the scooters when they come to the end of their life? So when they're beyond repair, what do we do with them? And we've got agreements in place with other operators to make sure that we either reuse or recycle all of our scooters. So we never bin a scooter. And I think we've all seen the horror images of dockless bikes from a few years ago, and particularly in parts of the Middle East where they're just sort of piled up. Because you have, some of these mobility models where you just get thousands of vehicles on a street, and we need to make sure that, as I say, we're looking at the whole supply chain. So I don't think there's any great difference in between e-bikes and e-scooters. From our point of view, they're using the same energy. It's the same model in terms of swappable batteries. We use green energy for all of our warehouses. But the important thing you need to think about with these vehicles and these types of services, I think, is to make sure that the whole of a supply chain is green, and not just, as I say, the fact that a vehicle has the letter E in front of it, is obviously a positive move forward, the fact that it's an electric vehicle. But it's important that businesses such as Void, look at the whole life cycle and the whole contribution to the local city that they're in. So beyond the vehicle itself, but their actual supply chains as well.
I mean, I brought it up, but clearly it's got people in the chat excited as well for how we decarbonise road. And clearly, I think we answered the question, which is that clearly moving more road freight onto rail where possible is obviously one option. It's easier to then electrify a rail line than it is necessarily to think about how you would decarbonise a fleet of trucks as a comparator. But do any of the panel want to come in on hydrogen as a potential fuel? In terms of its use in road networks? Clearly, Tricia, hydrogen trains are also being deployed elsewhere as a potential on your network. I know there's over in Teesside, in another part of the north of England, there definitely are ongoing opportunities in that space. But does anyone have a view on hydrogen as a wider fuel, whether it's in rail or on roads? I think that might sort of answer the question we've got, which is that if we can get the hydrogen economy in the north of England to really thrive the way we know it could, that could be a solution. Of course, maybe a discussion to go into more depth for those who are interested in the hydrogen economy session, which is starting shortly after this one when we finish. But does anyone want to come in on hydrogen? And we'll just talk about in the round. So anything you want to say about hydrogen, we'll take your views, but hopefully answer that HGV question whilst we're doing it.
I've got a few comments about the HGVs as well, and not just surrounding.
Glad to have it.
Not just surrounding the hydrogen, although that is obviously one of those exciting developments which is underway, but also because there was a specific question asked about electrification of HTVs, which does seem a long way off. And part of the problem of that is that actually the weight of batteries means that the size of battery that is needed for an HTV is too large to actually make the HTV sufficient. So I know that the government, through the Innovate round of investment, has just run a competition on essentially the sort of electrification of the network, so the vehicles charge as they move along. And I know that that competition is closed. I'm not sure of the results yet of it, but I know, so there is key movements in terms of electrification of the HGV network, as well as the using hydrogen as a fuel. The only other thing I was going to point out about the HGV is that actually part of the moving towards a sustainable future, I don't know how many people are aware out there, but the current way in which logistics operates is in itself very unsustainable. The average fill leaving a depot is about 60% of a van or a vehicle. And this is because of the demands that are being placed on logistics providers. The behavioral effects of customers has led to a bigger demand on logistics providers. And unfortunately, while I think that intermodal transport and using the rail network is absolutely part of the way forward, that demand means that there isn't a quick enough turnaround time at the moment to be able to use the road network. So there's a sort of a behavioural part for customers and all of us as part of society to slightly change, to almost reel in our expectations from the 24-hour delivery down to a more realistic and sustainable delivery time. And that part of that is what Moralis are working on with various projects. But yeah, that's pretty much what I have on HGVs at the moment. So,
does anyone else want to come in on hydrogen specifically, and then we'll maybe come back to you, Nicola, to maybe give a GM perspective on some of the things we've talked about, because I know we maybe haven't talked enough yet about cycling and walking, which obviously are a huge part of the story in terms of modal shift. But anyone else on hydrogen before we move on maybe to a more GM lens? Well, I think, Nicola, the floor is yours to give us some of your thoughts.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, I think we can see that the next 5 years are going to be absolutely critical in terms of starting to make much more serious inroads into decarbonising transport in Greater Manchester. So big infrastructure is important, and we continue to sort of plan and develop schemes around larger infrastructure projects. But I think we need to look very carefully at what we can deliver in the shorter term. So things like active travel, I think, have huge potential. But not just looking at transport improvements in isolation. So I think the idea of sort of 15-minute neighbourhoods where you have activities much more close to where you live, supported by better walking and cycling links into those local centres, is going to be a key part of starting to kind of reshape patterns of travel within towns and cities, and that has huge attraction, I think, in terms of creating more livable places, creating a more inclusive transition to net zero, and enabling people to access things closer to home and not always having to travel longer distances to go shopping or do leisure activities or do the sort of day-to-day things that they need to live good lives. So that's sort of some of the focus of our activity at the moment, and we're clearly rolling out a huge network of walking and cycling infrastructure improvements in Greater Manchester at the moment. We've had Chris Boardman as our cycling and walking commissioner for the last few years. He's just been, his role has just been sort of transitioned to transport commissioner. So he's now asking lots of great questions about how can we look at public transport alongside walking and cycling and make sure we've got a really fully integrated, sustainable transport network that people can access. So I think there's a whole load of stuff we can do in the near term around walking and cycling, around buses, and also around shared mobility. And it's good to hear what Sam was talking about. E-scooters, we've had a similarly really positive experience in Greater Manchester with our e-scooter trials, both in Salford and in Rochdale, which perhaps isn't what you'd necessarily consider normally to be kind of e-scooter sort of territory, but proving to be really popular, helping people to get from the train station into the town centre, for example. And we have a GM bike hire scheme that's also due to launch in the autumn. So huge amount of investment, a huge amount of in the short term that I think will really start to help people to transition to lower carbon lifestyles, certainly with respect to transport.
Thanks so much, Nicola. So, I mean, we're kind of, I suppose, coming to our kind of closing insights, really. And I mean, there's been a lot of, I think, really great discussion. So thank you to those of you who've been with us for your conversation in the chat. It's been really interesting to pick up all those points and questions. I suppose I kind of maybe wanted to come back on aviation, Andy, just to really understand what the opportunities might be for that kind of that improving of surface access, because that is something that could be done more quickly. To what extent do you think accelerating MPR, getting some of those early wins around less car journeys to the airport, what role do you think that could play? And has the government really understood the importance of MPR for decarbonisation, not just for economic benefit? Because I think clearly we've heard from a team, but you alluded to the airport support for it, which obviously we've always incredibly appreciated. I know it's one of the reasons MPR is going to happen, is because the airport has made the case for it in terms of its international gateway to the north and its role that it plays for cities like where I'm stood in Bradford, as well as for the wider northwest, Liverpool in particular, around that improved connection it will have to the airports with that extra connectivity. What do you think we can do to really win the argument on MPR from an environmental perspective, not just from an economic one?
I think go back to your start of your question of do they get it? I think absolutely the government get the value of it, both in sustainability terms and the whole rationale for the project across the board. I sort of have some sympathy for them that they've got a lot of big issues to deal with and trying to balance the books when coming out the other side of COVID. I guess my plea to them would be not to let any corners be cut off what is a fantastic scheme that will be critical for the whole of the North, and genuine sustainability is a massive part of that. What can it do in terms of aviation sustainability? Some people might not realise that MAG is not just Manchester Airport, it's also London Stansted Airport and East Midlands Airport. And Stansted, where I'm actually sat today, is really front runner in terms of public transport access, and shows that you can, with good rail links, drive up your public transport to be more than 50% of people coming to the airport taking public transport. So the more lessons we can learn about what's been achieved with really solid investment in public transport, the better. I think what I would just beg is that they give it the focus it deserves, come out with the integrated rail plan that we're all waiting for, and then dive into some of those detailed conversations about sustainability and all of the other benefits it will bring in a really focused way, and just make as much progress as we can as quickly as possible, because it would be a real shame if we got distracted by other things and didn't deliver this just no-brainer of a scheme, basically.
Well, no, I mean, it isn't a session about Northern Transport if we don't bring up the IRP. And the reason I am stood in a car park in Bradford is that the Shadow Transport Secretary is on his way here now, along with the new. So that's why I couldn't be sat in a nice sort of cosy office today, but I'm out and about. And I suppose I really want to come to you, Tricia, for a last word to kind of G us up. I got here today on one of your services. I mean, certainly MPP's carbon footprint is massively improved by all those wonderful electrified services you already do offer, and a lot of them are incredibly good quality services that do compete with the car and that demonstrate. You have to go to the southeast, right, to see the benefits of an electrified railway for driving up commuter passenger traffic. In terms of your kind of how much do you think the rail industry in the GB Railways era can start to think about particularly electrification in the round? I'm obviously very excited about the benefits of MPR electrification between Leeds and Bradford as an early win of MPR, not just because it will help people get to the airport actually, but because it will also give better services, more reliable services for those who use the conventional rail network. Because by bringing forward that electrification, by putting in more benefit those who use the existing services, not just future passengers. To what extent do you think that kind of new approach in the rail industry, of which obviously Northern is a key part, one of the most important franchises in the country in terms of its scale, in terms of what it can do for economic growth. What do you think is the opportunity for the industry now there is going to be that more strategic, joined up approach to how the industry is going to be run?
Yeah, I think you've just said it there in terms of it's got to be a joined up approach. So actually bringing, track and train closer together has got to be a good thing. We're seeing that already. We're working in close partnership with our routes in the Northwest and on the east of the Pennines. And, approaching these things together has got to be absolutely the way forward. And sustainability is at the core of our, fleet replacement strategy. For me, there's something as well about customer behaviour. And it's incumbent on all of us to be able to provide customers with better information about the environmental impact of their journey. So Sam mentioned the whole sort of end-to-end supply chain. Well, actually, if somebody's travelling to Manchester Airport, for example, on one of our trains, let's give them more information about the end-to-end environmental impact of their journeys, then they might choose to travel by train instead of take the car to the airport. So it's that whole joined up integrated approach, and Nicola mentioned that as well, in terms of how we look at buses, how we integrate the last mile, walking, cycling, all of that strategy of a more integrated, holistic approach has got to be the right way.
Thank you so much to our panel. We're running out of time, so I think we now need to disappear so that you can go, if you are here in the circle, to the hydrogen economy session, which I mentioned earlier, or creating a sustainable supply chain session. They're happening shortly down in the expo area. But thank you so much to our panel. It's been great to see you, if albeit only virtually, and I can't wait to see many of you again in person when we're all able to do that. So thanks so much for making the time to be here. I know, Tricia, we're going to see you on one of your trains very soon, as well as us being on them independently, but actually be on the same service. So thank you so much to everyone, and it's been great to have you here, and thanks for those of you who've been taking part, particularly in the chat. Really great to have that conversation, even though we can't do it in person at the moment. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.